Thank you for organizing this conference. Photographic prints were important for the production of books on Egypt in the second half of the 19th century, since they helped to support the credibility of the depicted sites. Since the invention of daguerreotype in 1839 and the French politician François Arago's public notice of the same year that encouraged Egyptologists to use photography to support the accuracy of their representations, photography has been part of the European encounter with the East. The French daguerreotypists, Frédéric Goupil-Fesquet, here on the left, and Joseph Philibert Giraud de Pranget, whose work is presented here on the right, they were the first to use the medium to record Egyptian ancient and modern structures, respectively in 1839 and 1841. The discovery of new processes, such as the calotype, used in Egypt by the French photographer Maxime Dicon, and the wet collodion employed by the British Orientalist Francis Fried, in addition to the growth of the number of photographic studios in Cairo and the boom in tourist photography, popularized photography as a useful, convenient, and necessary technique to guarantee the success of future publications on Egypt. One such publication that reused photographic sources for the preparation of its illustration was l'Arabe. Published in 3 volumes between 1869 and 1877 in Paris by the private printing house of Morel. This luxury work on Islamic Egypt, attributed to the French Egyptologist Émile Pries-Daven, whom I will call from now simply Pries or the Egyptologist. This work contained in total 200 large-size lithographic and chromolithographic plates. The visuals were supposed to be made after the newly amassed material that included photographic prints and was gathered by Pries during his scientific mission to Egypt from 1858 to 1860. The first volume of the book featured the most important monuments of Islamic Cairo, as seen here in the middle with the example of the 15th century funerary complex of Sultan Qaitbay, occasionally added to the composition's human figures, helped to understand the scale of the buildings and gave to this depiction a more ethnographic character, suggestive of the local Egyptian atmosphere. The remaining 2 volumes of l'Arabe contain chromolithographs or colored lithographs depicting Islamic designs presented out of scale for the visual contemplation, in the fashion that was established earlier by the architect Owen Jones in Britain and Jules Bourgoin in France, who also published illustrated albums. Pries reused photographic studies for the preparation of many of l'Arabe's illustrations, both those showing more contextualized scenes and those with abstract images of Islamic ornament. This is attested by the study of his huge archive stored at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. This collection comprises 2,000 various visual sources, a sample of which can be seen here, including also photographs. These materials served Pries as a reference material for the preparation of his publications, including also l'Arabe. This paper will look at the sample of photographic prints stored in the archive in a way to see how the sources were reused in the preparation of l'Arabe. And by doing so, I would like to point out the issues of technical difficulty and economy of production that was associated with the production of, with the reproduction of photography in books such as l'Arabe, and issues which were likely to affect the image of Egypt that was conveyed to the readers through such dynamic cross-cultural books. The second half of the 19th century witnessed massive improvements in technical processes that allowed the photographic prints to be mechanically reproduced in books instead of simply being pasted as separate prints into the pages of the publication. This is, however, not what happened with the photographs that served for the preparation of l'arabe, the illustrations, which were rather redrawn or copied by the hands of the artists or printmakers into an intermediary study, which could be then transferred into a lithographic stone for printing. It appears that for priests, photographs were an essential tool that helped to speed up the process of drawing in Egypt, also to support the veracity of the architectural details that he rendered in his plates, while also providing certain inspiration for him when he was at work in France, far away from these sites. But at the same time, the Egyptologists did not seem to value the artistic attributes of photographs on their own merits. Moreover, he did not necessarily want his printed images to look like photographs, since he wrote in a letter to his friend, Charles Cournot, "I am resorting in this moment to heliography, but its use is quite limited, expensive because of multiple correction, and it resembles too much photography." Heliography was one of the first photomechanical methods of reproduction, a non-manual process that had recourse to photography. Priests use heliography only in this one l'arabe's illustration seen here on the left. The reason that the Egyptologists did not like his illustrations to resemble photographs might have been the contemporary public debate that often pointed out the non-artistic and pseudo-industrial character of the medium. Photography probably did not align with the Egyptologist envisioned plan, which was to outdo previous significant and size, long-cherished French illustrated albums on Egypt made before the advent of photography. Carefully prepared by engravers and lithographers and highly recognized for their artistic value and technical skills, these early works included La Description de l'Égypte, or a description of Egypt, here on the left, made during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, but also the French architect's Pascal Coste Arab architecture, or the monuments of Cairo. An example of that work is seen here in the middle. Both works also featured in a similar fashion that Priest's book, the most famous Cairan monuments, such as the 14th century Sultan Hassan Mosque. However, these publications were sponsored by the state and made more with a scholarly goal rather than that for the money-related purposes. L'arabe was rather a commercial venture that arose in a period of intensive transformation in printing industry and in book production. Working in this context might have pressed priests to deal with the growing concurrence on the market for books and studies on Egypt, and to reuse photographs to speed up the process of production of his book and support the credibility of his scenes. But on the other side, priests also looked for new strategies that would make his illustration appear less as photography, but more in line with the prestigious publications on Egypt made earlier in the century. Many of the photographs that are stored in his archive were made by the French photographer Edouard Jarot, who accompanied priests in 1858 for the 2-year mission to Egypt. Jarot provided him with album and prints, which priests then reused in l'arabe, as seen here with the photograph of the tomb made by Jarot, which was then reused in Priest's lithograph, representing the 18th century funerary structure located in Cairo. And Priest could then add his own drawings of figural composition and apply it also to this composition and the final illustration. In addition to works made by Jarot, one can find in Priest's archive a number of photographic prints that were attributed to the French commercial photographic companies, such as Royal and Offier and Désiré, as in the case of the album and print representing the funerary complex of Qaitbay in Cairo, seen here. This commercial print could have served Priest as a point of comparison for his photographic views that he had commissioned from Jarot in Egypt, seen here in the middle, and which were used for the preparation of his famous architectural site as featured in one of l'arabe's lithographs, seen So, according to the French scholar Sylvie Aubenas, Jarreau's, in quote, mastery of photography is in fact complete, end of quote, and he had a good comment of the processes of the development of photographs for which he used various paper support. The photographs he made in Egypt were somehow problematic for priests once priests started to work on arabe. This may explain why the Egyptologists needed to use other sources purchased from commercial sellers in order to support his study of architecture. In fact, Jarreau's images were not always focused and precise, and especially comprehensive of all architectural elements that captured the attention of the Europeans and that priests wanted to feature. For instance, he based his final plate of the Mosque of Qaitbay on Jarreau's photograph. However, Jarreau's image, which is seen here again in the middle, had cut off the top of the towering minaret, which priests needed to fill in. Although Priest's photographer made several other images which featured the same monument, none of the sources captured these religious structures from its main entry site, which presented probably the best known view of the monument, and was already pictured in previously mentioned Pascal Coste's work. Priests, by presenting a similar view to the one of Coste, but from a different distance, wish to depict a greater number of the facade's decorative elements with precision, thus outdoing his predecessor. This is further supported by the fact that Priest certified in his notes his desire to emulate Coste's views of Cairo, which he considered to be inaccurate, but also because this lithograph made by Coste is kept in Priest's archive and might have served him as a point of reference or comparison for the photographs of this mosque made by his photographer, Jarreau. Concerning the albumen print made by the commercial company here on the left, this photograph might have helped priests to understand the proportions of the monument's architectural elements, such as the minaret. This analysis of the series of images of the Mosque of Qaitbay that are stored in Priest's archive show how the images priests collected on site from Jarreau may have been inadequate to satisfy all of his visual needs once at home. It also suggests the existence of some technical difficulties that priests faced while working on arabe, such as the visual and technical limitation of his own photographs made by Jarreau in Egypt. They were caused by various factors, such as the dense medieval architecture of Cairo that did not allow priests and Jarreau to capture the landmarks of the Egyptian capital from an unobstructed view. Even though priests believed in 1860, when he returned from Egypt, that he had, in quote, collected enough to publish the most beautiful work that has ever been made about Egypt, end quote. The technical difficulty that his sources posed in terms of the preparation of comprehensive and visually appealing views forced him to think about other ways to cover the gaps in his archive. This was done not only by using the photographs which were made by commercial companies, but also by employing in his published work other borrowed visuals that were appropriated by him without referencing the original authors of the sources. In fact, priests also reused the details and figures featured in the photographs attributed to the French-German photographer Ernest Benek, who visited Egypt with his camera in 1852, and whose image priests reemployed in arabe. A female figure in Priest's plate is a reworked copy of the Nubian woman pictured on Benek's photograph. The posture of the figure, her dress, and some of her accessories are the same as those presented on Priest's plate. The figure's facial features were, however, changed. Additionally, Benek's photograph is kept in Priest's archive, along with other documents that serve the Egyptologist for the execution of this particular view. Among them is also a print representing a musician playing the violin, which was reused by priests in the same lithograph, probably in order to give a more ethnographic ambience to his architectural views. Interestingly, this feature was taken from La Description de l'Égypte, published earlier in the century. The resulting representation of Egypt that was supposed to be based on Pries's original material became a mixture of his own architectural studies with borrowed or appropriated elements made by other authors whose names were obscured in the book. Finally, Beneke's images try to capture the daily atmosphere of Egypt, and Pries might have sought this kind of source in order to animate his architectural views with human figures, which were often blurred or not visible in the photographs made by Gérard. The constraints of the medium, such as the long exposure time, unwillingness of Egyptians to be captured by the lens of the camera, or sometimes simply the absence on the represented size, did not allow photographers such as Gérard to capture the movement of people and the local street atmosphere at the same time when they recorded the architectural site. Therefore, the photographer often needed to make a choice between the human rendering of the static view of architecture, between a human rendering or the static view of architecture, since a single view could not adequately encompass both. Gérard usually sacrificed the ethnographic details that Pries was interested in, especially that these images also appeared in earlier publications on Egypt that Pries wanted to emulate. In conclusion, although photographic prints were important for the production of French books on Egypt around 1870s, for the author of l'Arabe, these sources were not necessarily recognized for their artistic value and technical skill. Returning from his travels in Egypt, Pries discovered the limitation of the photographic sources he possessed, which could concern the quality, visual legibility, as well as the technical difficulty that the copying of these images could impose during the book's production process. This in turn could force him to look for other photographic sources on the market or find new ways of filling the gaps in the visual sources with borrowed or appropriated materials taken from other prints and photographs. These issues had the potential to affect the creation of knowledge about Egypt emerging from a book such as l'Arabe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you for your fascinating talk. And have you any questions?
Thank you. If nobody can ask, I will ask. Very short question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mentioned in your speech, you mentioned British Orientalist. British Orientalist, you mentioned, and then you saw the ornament of Owen Jones and other French people. So regarding that, I have two questions. One is, what is the difference between British Orientalists and French Orientalists when they deal with architecture? If you can, I just come to my curiosity, okay? Second, this ornament, how can we believe? Because if we take picture by the camera, it doesn't become flat. So how can we think this is authentic, this ornament? I mean, this old drawings, ornament drawing. How can we, whether they took from camera, then it doesn't over whether they, how can we believe this is authentic, this ornament which you showed?
So I'm sorry, the second question was how, when a camera is capturing an ornament, how can we believe that this is, as viewers of this image?
Yeah, because it's two-dimensional. And because
I see.
Photography is three-dimensional, so it can be okay, a little bit different, no problem. But the grammar of ornament should be correct geometrically. So how could they make all this correctly? That's my curiosity.
That's a great question, and yeah, I mean, like, that the fashion for ornamentation and for representing this flattened out representation was partly driven by the kind of industrial way of kind of renewing that industrial goods, right, in Britain in particular, but generally in Europe, and kind of enliven them with some of the the motifs that were coming from different cultures. And so first, the need would be to actually show not necessarily something, I think, which would be very would kind of follow, if this was used for this particular reasons, the accuracy wouldn't be as much perhaps important, because this would be used as a tool for simply creativity, or kind of inciting creativity of European designers and architects. So the flattened, the photography here would be kind of helpful to speed up the process of production of these images. But I think the accuracy itself would not have been such an issue in the images that were kind of flattening out this and abstracting completely this ornament. On the other side, such images were then, I think the artist kind of understood that there's a problem with that, the dimensionality of that, because there's, and for instance, in Price's archive, there are studies then of color. So there's a photograph being taken of a specific monument, but there's also additional drawings that show a part, at least, of this monument showing color. And sometimes this color helps to also show the annotation, the tonality helps to show actually the dimensions of the monument. But then how, you know, some of this then is shown through chromolithography, but I think also it's used more for those, I mean, photography and these drawings that show the dimensionality are mostly used for images which are showing contextualized version of this architecture. So for scenes which are shown, where architecture is shown more in a social context, that is abstract representation of ornament, mostly to kind of incite the creativity of Western architects. And please let me know if it doesn't, or I misunderstand your question. For the first one, so how the British and French Orientalists deal with architecture, if they, I understand that this is if they deal differently.
Approach, how do they approach?
I think that depends about which medium we speak. If we speak about photography, I think they all kind of learn from each other, because the French and British circles are very kind of intertwined in Egypt, and most of these ideas just go through Canal La Manche, and the people. This is a very small circle actually of people, and I don't personally, I haven't think about that much, and I haven't, there's no answer that comes to my mind right away. But I think they were so close to each other, and although there was certain competition, like a larger competition, some possible competition between them, but they were all kind of looking very closely at what is published on each market in France and Britain. And Price actually was also publishing in Britain, so he was also working with British publishers as he was in France. So I don't see personally, I don't think as of now, I have to think about it, but I don't think like there's this particular difference within that approach. I'm happy to hear any comments if there is.
We have one question, please, Susan.
Yes, thank you, Paulina, very much. I have two questions for you. One, I was very interested in the quotation from Price's letter that you put on the screen, saying that he was wary of heliogravure as a method. First, because it was expensive and required, there was a financial consideration. But this phrase that it looked too much like photography is very interesting, because it suggests that photography is a negative value in a reproduction, illustrated books at this time. And you've argued effectively, as if I understand it, that he was using photographs as a kind of preparatory drawing, as a kind of sketch material to facilitate the final work. but that the final work, the illustration in the final work, the standard, if you will, the gold standard for him would have been Buren engraving. And you referred to the earlier publications in this area, notably the Description de l'Égypte, as his kind of reference. That seems to me incredibly early, as too early as a reference to account for that kind of comment coming as late as he's saying that. And so I'm wondering if you have a broader sense of what the, if you will, the sort of publication standard, the desire and taste for illustration of these, this is a folio publication, I believe, at this period, and what in a way that had to do, why that was still desired, even though it's a very traditional and almost old-fashioned technique at this time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'll come to my second question later, which is quite different.
Thank you. So Priest's images were actually made through the technique of lithography, which started to be more popular.
Just say that again.
He uses lithography.
Lithography, okay.
Yes, so yeah, the description of Egypt was known for a very high quality of copper plate engravings, and right. But it seems the copper plate engraving, it's still very much, I mean, I think for Priest it's something which is this high standard, but something which the publisher will not allow him to use. And also there's this new lithography, which is much easier to use, and it kind of becomes more popularized in 1840s, and Owen Jones in 1855 also shows that you can do colored photography and apply this to the representation of different cultures. So this is that's true that I think Priest sees still the engraving as like some sort of staple to kind of look to, but he understands there are new methods and which the publishing industry now kind of suggests, and which helps also to reproduce a lot of this in color. But what's interesting, the arabe has been produced over 8 years. So there's a variety, there are many changes coming on during this time. It's being published from 1869 in installments, and it ends in 1877. So, and there are 3 volumes. So they are published in installments. And the first installments that will produce later, the first volume of the book, it's all black and white, and it's all kind of lithography, really looking at representation very similar to what Priest what description of Egypt did, like very contextualized scene. But then the second volume and the third volume, it's focused mostly on chromolithographs, which show ornament, mostly either flattened out or still contextualized, but really ornament. So there's this change coming up. And Priest left notes about this process in actually his letters to his friend, and saying that he actually did not like the fact that the publisher pushed him to abandon his cherished plan of using more contextualized scenes for something which is more industry driven. So there's this very sharp, and I addressed this in a different article, and kind of very sharp change within the publishing industry, that he is kind of forced by the publisher to go for that ornament and to actually go more into the to follow more chromolithography in general. And he sees this as this artistic quality, this what I think he wants to show something which is very artistic, like the description of Egypt, but he's not happy that it's now being turned into the context of the industry, that he thinks that he's selling himself basically for that, and then actually at the end he dies 2 years after the last installment were published, and the publisher then re-edits a new edition of it, which is only focused on the abstract Islamic ornament in chromolithography. So it's kind of interesting. There's lots of changes and debates about, I think, also the medium and what is being used. But he, I think, still operates in this kind of more, perhaps at the time, old-fashioned way of doing something to compare himself with this early 19th century techniques and sources.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating what you just said about the intrusion of the editor in affecting the look and content of the publication. And I think book historians have called this the era of the editors, where the publisher editor had more of an influential role over the artist, graphic artist, in determining content, particularly if it was being pushed toward ornamental design, which would have fed into the market following the design reform movement that came out of the universal exhibitions in the 1850s. And that touches on the other question I wanted to ask you, which was about the financing of these. Did the publisher put up the money for these? And did I understand you to say that it was a French-British cooperation? Was there a kind of a cooperation between editor publishers in London and Paris to finance this multi-volume, multi-year production?
No, so this was mostly French enterprise. I spoke about the different work that he did in Britain, but 20 years earlier actually, and but no, this is a French publisher who is actually very much related to the School of Fine Arts in Paris. So that's also the drive, I think, for the designs, which it's very important for the publisher. So Pries actually, the materials he gathered, the photographs, were part of a scientific mission, partly sponsored by the French ministry in around 1860s. Right. But it seems like the ministry was kind of added a little money to another book he published on antique monuments, so on antiquity, but they kind of abandoned the plan of doing anything with modern Egypt, and Pries kind of took those images and went to publishers to publish them by himself. I don't know how much he would add to it, but I think because it was published in installments, it was super costly. It was published in installments, so to spread out the cost of publication, I think the publisher simply invested, but the publisher was kind of, there were lots of negotiation about the cost of production, also with the printmakers who were making and were kind of debating again about techniques, and he was complaining that he had to use many different printmakers because not everyone could do architecture and figures well as he wanted. So there was a cost of production that was debated over years, and also he involved other collaborators with whom he also negotiated the price. So I think it was a very and I don't know all the details. It's more that kind of idea of what was happening through the letters he was sending and complaining about this process to his friends. There are no receipts necessarily, no publishers archive about this process, but it was a very complex one in which Pries, I think, lost more than he gained eventually at the end, because when he died, he was quite poor, and he complained that the publisher kind of put him away almost from the production process, and he felt like he lost overall.